Megan Rapinoe has decided to weigh in, and what Megan Rapinoe has said about transgender youth participation is completely wrong, and I'm going to explain exactly why that is. But she said, everyone out there who is, I'm reading, this is a direct quote from Megan Rapinoe to Time Magazine. I would encourage everyone out there who is afraid someone's going to have an unfair advantage over their kid to really take a step back and think, what are we actually talking about? We're talking about people's lives. I'm sorry, your kid's high school volleyball team just isn't that important. Excuse me. The reason why we play sports is to compete at a high level. And it may not be very important to Megan Rapinoe what happens on a high school women's volleyball team, but for the girls on that team in high school, it matters a great deal. And they are breaking all sorts of putting forth all sorts of effort to make their team as good as they can possibly be. And Megan Rapinoe's just going to say it's not that big of a deal if a dude decides he wants to play women's high school volleyball and starts dominating because he happens to identify as a woman, a grown man effectively with male testosterone who is bigger, stronger, faster than the female athletes. I disagree. I think it is a big deal. That's the very essence of competition. It's why we separate men's and women's athletes in the first point, because if we didn't, then women's athletes by and large wouldn't win competition. Well, think about this for a minute. When the U.S. women's soccer team was training for the World Cup, they got whipped by a group of under 15-year-old boys in Dallas, Texas. This wasn't the greatest under 15-year-old boys team ever. This was a collection of the best boys players in Dallas. And they were still young. It was 15 and under. Top athlete, 15 and under boys soccer players were better in the city of Dallas alone than the best women were in the entire country. Top high school boys soccer teams would dominate the U.S. women's soccer team. That's not because the U.S. women's soccer team is no good. It's because boys, and certainly boys who are on the edge of becoming men, are bigger, stronger, and faster than the women. Would Megan Rapinoe think it was fair if an entire group of men's soccer players who weren't good enough to play women's soccer decided they were going to play men's soccer, decided they were going to identify as women and started taking all of the women's soccer team spots? Would that be fair? Would that be a big deal to her? What about if Christian Pulisic just decided to become Christina Pulisic and become the best women's soccer player in world history and take away a spot on the U.S. women's soccer team? Would that be a big deal to Megan Rapinoe? See, what's happening here is Megan Rapinoe's career is essentially over. And now she's saying athletics don't matter very much because she's making the choice that transgender athletes matter more than women's athletes. Well, look, transgender athletics is not an issue if a woman decides to identify as a man. That person will never make high-level athletic competitions as a man because that person is a woman. And so it's not an issue in competition. This only becomes an issue in competition when men decide to identify as women. And that is why the women's swimming group, swimming group, decided that the Leah Thomases of the world are not able, that's men who identify as women, are no longer able to compete against women. 71% of them voted in favor of this. It's the very essence of competition. And if you take it away from transgender athletics and just say, hey, should an 18-year-old be able to be trans age and play against 13-year-old competitors? Of course not. Should someone who is a heavyweight boxer be able to identify as a smaller weight class and fight against flyweights? No. And similarly, Men should not be able to identify as women and dominate in their competitions. Megan Rapinoe is a fraud. She benefited from all of the money for women's athletics, and as soon as her athletic career is coming to a close, she's trying to pivot entirely into politics and argue that you shouldn't care if men are dominating women's sports. She should be ashamed of the arguments she's making. But I do give her credit because unlike most people in sports, she's at least picking a choice. You either believe in women's athletics or you believe in transgender rights. Eventually, those two platforms collide and you have to make a choice. I'm in favor of women's athletics. Megan Rapinoe is in favor of a man pretending to be a woman being able to be the greatest female athlete of all time, probably because her athletic career is coming to a close.